The following is a presentation of Tuning into Sci-Fi TV, the viewer's guide to genre television.
Welcome to a bonus show for Game of Thrones Season 5. I am Wendy Hembrock, and I am joined today by a quorum of the small council. Introduce yourselves, please.
Hey, this is Shannon, and I'm in Vancouver, Washington.
And this is Jesse Jackson from Dallas, Texas. And I am the master of making the quorum.
Yes, and I am the mistress of schedules, and we were waiting for Jesse to weigh in. Lou and Christine could not be here tonight. Tonight, what we have on tap is talking about a couple of links of interest, and then we're going to continue talking about a couple more of the videos from the guys from the Game of Thrones Academy on a couple topics that we found particularly interesting and also resonated a lot with things we've talked about before. Also want to remind folks that we have a question to the listeners asking about your interest in listening to the small council talk about a season 1 rewatch. So if you're interested, check out the blog post and let us know, yes or no, if you're cracking open your DVDs or you're doing something else. We would love your feedback on that, and we'd love your feedback on anything Game of Thrones related. So let's go on over and talk about a couple links. First is a really cool inside look to the special effects behind the making of the Daznak's pit fight in Meereen, where Drogon shows up. And this was actually the special effects that got nominated for the Emmy. I know a lot of people were confused why they didn't submit the episode that was the big battle at Hardhome for its special effects. But take a look at this and you might see why. It's pretty complicated. We also have links to two really good interviews. One is from The Guardian talking to Peter Dinklage about his career and sort of before Game of Thrones and after. That is a very nice sort of look behind the scenes with him. He's kind of a shy guy, so this was probably one of the most revealing, lengthy interviews I've read of him in a while. And the other is a Telegraph interview with Natalie Dormer talking about the kind of roles she's getting these days. And it talks a lot about sexuality of characters. And I thought she had some really insightful comments that were definitely worth reading.
Yeah, just about all three of those. It's kind of a toss-up as to what had the most impressive special effects between the two you mentioned, Wendy. I mean, personally, I might have gone with Hardhome, given that it was kind of wall-to-wall. I mean, there were so many things that had to be done in that, whereas the pit, that was certainly impressive, but it was maybe 12 to 15 minutes at the end of the episode where it was all loaded in. Both of them were outstanding achievements. And the thing that everything that was realized about that dragon was fantastic. And they peel back the layers and you could see how much detail went into the musculature and the skeleton that they created. And then all the expressiveness in the eyes and the gums and the close-ups and everything. And you also just see how good Emilia Clarke was at reacting and caring for basically a tennis ball or a bunch of pixels too. But there's that one shot that I think everybody calls the never ending story shot that I don't know what they could have done. Maybe another angle or something. That's the only one that didn't quite work for me, but it was pretty fantastic. And like Wendy said, that Guardian interview with Dinklage was also good. If you have, the first thing I noticed him in, like a lot of people, was The Station Agent with him and Bobby Cannavale. And if you haven't seen that, that's a fantastic movie. You should go watch that. I don't know if it's streaming. I bet it is. And then the Natalie Dormer interview, she also talks a lot about the perception of being a corset queen like a Keira Knightley or somebody else when she hasn't done that much of them, though she got her start on The Tudors. And her answers about sex and violence and politics and a lot of that were really smart. So that's a good piece.
Yeah, I am not as... I don't enjoy a lot of the making of videos. It's just kind of, after a while, I just kind of, it was magic, and that's enough for me. But I really loved both interviews. I especially liked the Natalie Dormer. I'm such a fan of hers, and I just think she's really charming, and I had forgotten that she was in the latest Hunger Games movie, and I was like, oh, look, it's Natalie Dormer, when I was rewatching it on the whatever cable channel it's on. And she's really good in that, and I loved her in Elementary, and so I think that's great. And it is interesting, as Shannon talked about, that she's promoting a new series that's going to be on BBC. Hopefully it'll end up on BBC America sometime, but she wasn't going to do a period piece, but she was worried about getting typecast, and she just loved the material. And we talked a little bit about this before we started recording. I thought it was interesting that Peter Dinklage mentions, the article, that he only spends 3 months, filming his, part of Game of Thrones. And I would have thought it would have been longer. But, then we start talking about all the post work and the after work and special effects and all that stuff, that you could see how principal filming, right, could just, you that 90 days, 100 days, push through it. And then they have to do all the, as I talked about at the very beginning, this magic to make it look good. So good stuff, as always, Wendy.
Thanks. Yeah, the special effects I thought was interesting because I would have also thought Hard Home would have been the obvious choice to submit for special effects, but there's a lot of complexity there. I don't have as much of a problem with that never-ending story similarity because I really like that movie, and it is kind of a nice sort of a girl with her dog moment, which you don't get too many of in Game of Thrones.
I like the cinema. I think it was just the execution looked more fake.
It did look pretty fake. I agree. But, it's a girl on a dragon. How it's going to be a little fake. The Peter Dinklage interview I thought was interesting because he made a really good point about, everyone talks about this is the golden age of TV writing and, cables, where it's at and stuff. And he points out very rightly so that the reason why cable can get away with this is because there's no advertisers mucking around with the story. The showrunners just get to do whatever they want. And so what they want can be really interesting and edgy and push buttons and be, a lot more risky than advertisers like. So I thought that was a very noteworthy point that he made. I also had no idea he wasn't from New Jersey, which is cool to learn. And also when he talked about enabling himself because of his schedule to make big movies, he was out on a press tour for Pixels, which I believe got sort of spotty reviews, but still, a big movie, a big budget movie. But he talked about independent films and wanting to stay in touch with making independent films because the reason that filmmakers are making those is not to have a mega blockbuster payday. He's like, you're making that to tell a story that's probably very personal to the tiny bit of people that are making the movie. So I like that a lot. And the Natalie Dormer interview I thought was interesting. One, because she was really acknowledging sort of how her career has been catapulted by Game of Thrones. But I really liked her comments about this project she's working on for the BBC that I think it's just a movie. I don't think it's actually a whole series. I think it's just a period drama, but it's called The Scandalous Lady W. And it's based on real events in which this woman, the wife of Lord, I think his name's Wolsey or Worsley, she gets caught with a lover by the husband, and they go to trial. But the husband doesn't sue the other guy for like cuckolding him or anything like that. He sues him for using her as chattel. And then it turns out that this woman, and this is based on true events, actually had like 40 other lovers, and he was a voyeur to events. So it gets really sordid. And I thought it was really interesting, her comments about being shocked that this was a true story. And also, I couldn't
believe that.
Yeah. And she's like, and she said, well, part of the reason why she was interested in this is, one, this was only about 200 years ago, that in England, this woman was property. She could not represent herself in a trial because she was chattel. The logic was, why would a woman speak? Because I wouldn't interview your dog if someone stole your dog. That was the thinking. And that's something that today, people can get a little bit on their high horse about feminism. And it's like, look, it's not that long ago that, a lot of people couldn't even vote in England. Only 15% of the population at that time could vote. So, there's a cautionary tale there about sort of apathy towards politics that I thought was really interesting. And then she talked a lot about how, she's in a lot of roles where, she's in positions that are, sexual in nature. There's a lot of nudity. And she made a couple interesting points. One was, romance, love, sex are huge motivations for human behavior. So they make for great drama. And, whatever she's sort of challenged, she sort of looks at what is it underneath that can be a learning opportunity for her when that happens. But, she's also very clear about the line between what's gratuitous, either sex or misogyny or violence, and how it serves the story. So I thought she had some really intriguing comments in her interview. Definitely, I just hit a couple of them. It's pretty lengthy. Both of the interviews are pretty lengthy. So good stuff as always.
And her comments about it and the nature of that true story, which again is just a head scratcher that really happened, compared and contrasted with some of the complaints about the role of women on Game of Thrones, in that setting being a medieval setting compared to our timeline would be hundreds and hundreds of years ago versus just a couple hundred years ago when this true story took place. It's always aggravating to me when people view period pieces through a modern lens. It's great to compare and contrast and do the, wow, we've come a long way and pat ourselves on the back for being an enlightened society. But there were awful things that happened to women, children, the poor, the people born with the wrong name, whatever. In a lot of these stories, whether it's Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or in revolutionary times. And I think you do yourself a disservice if you don't depict it with some degree of this is probably the way the society would have evolved. Because then you can go the other way and have something that's more utopian and wish fulfillment, like a Roddenberry's original vision for a Star Trek or any of the future set things. When you say, God, we've really left a lot of this baggage behind, and it's a much better place.
Yeah, I kind of wish we had a few more of those stories. I'm getting a little apocalypsed out, I got to admit. But that's a story for another show. So check out the links. Now I want to shift to our main topic. There's a couple of videos in particular I want to talk about. The first is about Braavos and the free cities, and sort of contrasting that with Westeros, because this story is told from the point of view, we're introduced to characters who are from Westeros, the Starks, the Baratheons, the Lannisters, all that. And there's this whole other world that we very slowly get introduced, not really until, season 3, and season 2, a little bit with Dany going to some of the free cities. But, the free cities in Itamar and Gil's view are sort of these parallels to the free cities that emerged after the Roman Empire fell. So Rome, the city of Rome, Naples, Florence, and they were established for trade. They're independent political units. They don't have a monarchy. They're kind of republics of some nature. They point out Pentos maybe has a prince, but that's really a job title. It's not really a monarchy type role. And because these cities have this purpose of executing trade, there's a lot of social mobility that goes with it. Versus in Westeros, you're stuck, you're the butcher's boy and you're going to be a butcher. There's only one character I can think of as kind of the exception that we've seen, which is Littlefinger, where he's probably gone outside of his rungs of his ladder more than some others. And the other one I think of is Varys, but Varys came from the free cities too. So everyone else is sort of stuck in their title and their job in terms of Westeros because of that feudalistic sort of constraint. And contrast that with like Braavos. There's no state religion in Braavos. All kinds of freed slaves and escaped slaves went there. And it's much more tolerant. In, I think it was Volantis, we had a red priestess out preaching in the street against slavery, even though they're slavers. She's advocating for Dany, who is, the breaker of chains and arguably an enemy or a threat, certainly to Volantis. But that kind of discourse is allowed to happen. Certainly some of that's going on in Westeros, but maybe not to the same degree. And really, even in Westeros, King's Landing isn't much of a city. It's not the hub of the economy. Old Town is a bigger city. It's also historically more established and legitimate. Aegon, when he came from Old Valyria, established King's Landing on purpose because he wanted a capital that wasn't actually the home of any ruling family. So it doesn't quite have the same oomph as some of these very old established cities. And these cities are the daughters. They're called the daughters of Old Valyria. So that was interesting because when you think about where the story's going, the folks in these free cities might go somewhere. They might go to Westeros. And there's an interesting theory put forth in one of the other videos about there might be a migration of Braavosi who are wealthy middle class. There's certainly people who can come with money, therefore influence into Westeros, and they would certainly bring their more tolerant merchant class ideas about capitalism there. They probably wouldn't want to be adopting the faith of the Seven. They'd want to keep doing whatever they do religion-wise. So there's a lot of interesting implications for what will happen if more of the people from the free cities and Braavos come to King's Landing or back, a Dany or someone else to run Westeros or try to lead Westeros at some point.
Yeah, I enjoyed this one of their video segments quite a bit. It's interesting too. We've talked about the differences between the book and the show before, and the way that you get information in the novels is always through point of view characters. And so we didn't learn too much about Braavos or the free cities from ever being there necessarily. We always heard other people talk about them in the novels. But because you don't really do that structure on the TV show, we actually saw it far more represented a lot earlier than we did in the books. I mean, in Pentos, we got Illyrio Mopatis I think it was even in the first episode where we meet Dany and Viserys and setting up the arranged marriage with Khal Drogo. And then we get to see the Iron Bank, actually in the Iron Bank, where it's something we just hear about for the longest time in the books. And so they kind of dig into how it's portrayed on the show and in the books and in some of the history, and get into the background that I think it was actually a slave revolt on a ship, and they found this place that was almost, because of the nature of the geography, that it's several islands or land masses, if you will, inside a big lagoon with a narrow entrance, and it's pretty defensible. And so not a lot of people knew where it was. So the escaped slaves formed the free city there. And so as Braavos has grown, it's become known for banking and commerce and capitalism. And they still, because of its history and foundation, have a very strong anti-slavery bent. And even though they're close in geography with Slavers Bay and some of those other economies, if you will, they try not to support them financially, just for philosophical and political reasons. So it makes a really interesting contrast in the area. And for all of Essos, when you look at it, for that matter, it's not as unified or warring to be unified as Westeros. It's a pretty fascinating history. And they do make a lot of good analogies historically. You could say Rome, you could say, I think when they were even talking a little bit, I saw some comparison to Athens too, in that it's a place that grew up with a lot of things going for it, but not necessarily like an agrarian part of their commerce, because the land wasn't great for growing. So they did a lot of the things based on trade and loaning of money and whatever. And Athens apparently was very similar. And so in order to expedite that trade, they developed a lot of roads and commerce, and things sprung out of that necessity. And they also make comparisons to, like you said, Wendy, the Italian city-states, and Venice being a capital of arts and creativity and freedom, and very diverse, because it's also diverse not only because they're open-minded and they're anti-slavery and it's kind of a free market capitalistic thing, but one of the things about that diversity is when the slavers were rounding up their slaves, they gathered them from all over, wherever the ships went or wherever people were conquered. So within the ranks of the captives, you had people from everywhere. And when those people escaped and founded Braavos, they were already a commingled and diverse culture. So their look on things and their marriages and children and other people that came in also kind of represented that makeup. So it's a pretty fascinating and I think realistic depiction of how some place like Braavos would develop.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting because, one of the things that I like about these two guys, knowledge is coming is kind of their bit, is they take this pretty seriously but with a sense of humor, so it isn't all dry. They make some jokes, they talk about it, and you guys have both covered a lot, but I thought it was interesting. He talked about, free enterprise coming, and I'm also always mindful that, it is foreign to our thoughts growing up where we grew up, the idea that your destiny, career-wise or, is locked in. That, we kind of start from the beginning and telling our kids as we're raising them, you can be whatever you want. And I thought that was an interesting point to say, in some of these cities, they are seeing that, but in most of them, you are what you are. If you become a butcher because your dad was a butcher, or you're a baker because your dad was a baker, and if you're female, you're going to get married, and there isn't that, choice. And, even to a certain degree with the Starks, Arya did not want to follow the path that her family wanted her to follow. And so I thought that was pretty cool and pretty interesting. They end all of these, if you guys haven't seen them, with a prediction. And this one I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, I thought it was very funny how Itamar went to very specifically say capitalism was not invented by Adam Smith in the 18th century. Adam Smith just analyzed conditions that already existed and were created in Italy. The word bank comes from the term for the long bank that the money lenders actually sat on. And when you needed a loan, you'd go see the guys at the bank. It was literally the guy sitting on a bench. It was like, hey, buddy, I need a loan. The other thing that they pointed out, and you talked about it a little bit, Jesse, was the notion that, being stuck in your role is bad for business. So you want that social mobility, you want the free flow of ideas, the entrepreneurial engine, is what's driving the capitalism system. So it was interesting to hear them talk about that, because when I saw the Bank of Braavos, I very much was thinking it's like the World Bank today, because they can decide who they're going to back. They were backing Stannis. They might be backing Varys somehow, or he might have some weird Swiss bank account thing going on with some other people who have some super PAC that he's drawing from to get money for Dany down the road or something. But I really liked the whole idea that the system that's in Westeros is the winners and losers. There's a lot of losers right now. It's a very unbalanced system. And there's just a lot more movement possible, which is probably something that's going to be desirable to more people as they get exposed to it also. The other thing that I thought was interesting was their bold predictions, and they didn't agree. So Gil, the blogger, was thinking that the Bank of Braavos would back Dany and her dragons because their interests are aligned. She is representing freedom, in terms of breaking up these slave cities, and might be bringing that sort of idea to Westeros, which they would be in alignment with. But Itamar, the historian, was thinking that Braavos would not accept Dany because of her dragons, because they're magical. Historically, the Valyrians used dragons to oppress people. They were used as a weapon of mass destruction. So that was interesting, because it was sort of like, Braavos could go either way they could be the game changer, depending on who they back going forward. So I like that. I think it's, it's one aspect of this show that we keep getting reminded of every once in a while, which is we're only seeing the characters we know and their point of view of the world. And there's other people outside that maybe have other plans and we're not aware of them and what's coming. So we talk.
And it's not, I'm sorry, it's not a pure good and evil either. I think they compared it at one point to Tolkien, where Sauron is evil and bad, and Frodo and the hobbits are good. And it's easy, and for the most part, there are a lot of things like Luke Skywalker is good and Darth Vader is bad or whatever. And it's easy to draw clear black and white delineations, but in Westeros, everything is muddy. For all the good that Dany's done, we've seen what kind of upheaval has resulted from her liberation of slaves and things from an economic standpoint that she didn't think about it. And it could go either way. She could be viewed as a liberator. She could be viewed as a magical oppressor. You don't know. And depending upon where you are in that whole conflict, both viewpoints could be equally valid.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in Meereen, Dany is a foreign occupier who has overwhelming force. She has technology that's beyond your capabilities.
And I think it's interesting that because we had a good discussion our last episode about dragons and how they aren't the magical, cure-all that they give you as many problems as they might give you solutions. And, here's a different one, right? That the Bank of Braavos, the Iron Bank, actually may not trust you because of that. And I think that's one of the reasons why, we're having these kind of discussions, on a show, because there's so much to discuss and there's all these different layers.
Yeah, I mean, these are complex people. They're not, characters with these very clear-cut outcomes that are going to come from their behavior. They have reasons for why they do what they do, and it isn't just because evil, and it's been said more than once, George Martin comes with the point of view that, humans, no matter what time period they were in, have always been as complex as they are now. And as contradictory and self-interested and weak and foolish and stupid and brilliant. So, it totally makes sense that we would see that in this world. And it certainly explains history better than any other explanation, right? It's just human nature keeps happening. The other video I wanted to talk about is the wall and the others. And this video focuses more on the wall and what it represents. And Itamar and Gil point out that, George Martin has said he was inspired by actually going to Hadrian's Wall, which was created by the Romans who were occupying that area. And he was thinking about it from the point of view of being a sentry standing watch on this wall. So probably by himself or maybe with one other person, seeing this vast beyond, this no man's land that was on the other side. And certainly the wall that's in the story is much, much bigger. Hadrian's Wall wasn't all that high. The point wasn't really to stop people coming over it, but to slow people down because of its length and how to get around it. And certainly, a horse couldn't jump over it. So it was enough of an obstacle that it would definitely cause an invading force some problems and slow them down. So that was sort of the context of what originally inspired the wall. There's certainly other walls, more modern parallels. The Berlin Wall, the Great Wall of China, which had a similar function, although it was much higher. There's people who would argue that there's a wall being built between Mexico and the U.S. border in the south, and certainly the wall that's in Jerusalem. So, and they're usually done to create a barrier between us, the civilization, and the unknown, the foreign, the hostile, the scary thing. So it's the barrier. And certainly in medieval times, the wall would represent the sort of mythical, magical separation to that no man's land, which was often a forest, which in the Middle Ages, the forest might as well be going to, the Antarctic or outer space. So you can find anything out there, right? You can find fairies and monsters and aliens and things that can survive in the ice and can survive with no light. And you can put all your superstitions beyond the wall. And that's kind of the context that's happening in Game of Thrones. So there's a great comment that Itamar makes about parallels between actually in the UK, what was beyond the wall were the Picts, who were the Scots. He claims there's a lot of similarities to the wildlings. They were forest people. They were raiders. They could certainly survive out in the woods and the wilderness, and were certainly viewed as hostile by, the English who were further south. And the implicit assumption is whatever's on the other side of the wall and whoever is over there is an enemy. And from the World of Ice and Fire book, there's a lot of speculation about who built the wall. Was it the children of the forest that worked with the giants and worked with the first men, and they all put up the wall against the others during the long night? There's an interesting theory by Itamar and Gill that maybe the others put up the wall to keep the northerners, the first men, out, keep them separated. So, and that's a big part of the bold prediction is up until this point, we view the others as, this evil, this, nameless evil. They're not understood. And the wall is what's holding back the tide. And of course, that means that, a wall presented in the first scene will come down, and maybe the others are not as evil as we think.
Yeah, going back to Hadrian's Wall, and when you look at that, you think, God, why did they go to such effort when, it's pretty easy to climb over. It's certainly not like the wall that we see in Game of Thrones. But, I followed a couple of Google and Wikipedia links on the creation of it. And, part of it was more of a spraying your territory, as it were, more just as much as a defensive position, just to say, a couple of things. One, that, hey, this is where my territory, my kingdom, as it were, extends to. But it was also almost a conciliatory act to say, look, we're not going to conquer beyond it, even though eventual emperors didn't exactly respect that initial notion. And then we don't know in the world of Westeros exactly how, and, was it were giants part of it? Were they coerced? Were they paid? Were they enchanted? How much magic was used? It had to be obviously someone skilled in architecture and building to erect something like that. And what knowledge of the others or the White Walkers did those people have who built it? I mean, obviously you're protecting south of the wall from something. So how much of those people know and how much of that has been lost to history? I did like there was a point about that if the wall does fall, which they do predict in those videos, that you don't put a wall up in the first act, not to have it come down at some point, about how that will also cause a change in demographics. We talked about Dany possibly coming over, and who all will be in her entourage. Will there be people from Essos? Will the Iron Bank, either through claiming of debts or investment or a combination of the two, take a more active interest in what's going on in Westeros? What upheaval to the political systems will there be when she comes over, and if she wins, or if somebody who's not in favor of a strict monarchy wins? And then you'll also have all these people that view themselves as free folk with a completely different culture come in, and how that will change the makeup of Westeros, assuming that the White Walkers don't come in and just kill everybody.
I really don't want the wall to fall. I don't know why I care in a fictional world, but that I did not like that, prediction. And I also thought it was interesting that he didn't, he said this isn't based on history. Most of the time when he's doing a bold prediction, he's doing a lot of based on history, and I'm just doing an educated guess. But he said, this is pure my knowledge of storytelling. And, he doesn't quote Chekhov, but, Chekhov's gun, but he implies that pretty strong. And I just hope it doesn't happen. It just seems that it's been up there so long. I just don't know if that's a story I want to see done, but we'll see what happens. I thought it was, they have a few jokes kicked in there about, they're taking our jobs away, and it was
the South Park references were hilarious.
It was,
Yeah.
and it was interesting to talk about, how often we build walls, as over the years, and the different things that they've been used for, and how interesting that is. And he's just done this, the Game of Thrones with their, with this massive wall. I know that before I knew anything about the show, when it would have been announced, I had people that had read the book saying, I can't wait to see how they're going to show this wall. This is going to be amazing. And I still don't think, I understand the scale as much as someone who's read the books. But good stuff as always.
Yeah, and I don't envision that the whole wall's going to fall down. I just envision, a breach that can't be fixed. It's like a big hole in Hoover Dam, right? The whole dam doesn't have to come down for it to be a disaster. I do agree, though, from a story point of view, especially after where we just ended with season 5, the Night's Watch is the last line of defense, and the thing that they own, that's their job, is defending the wall. And they're in a shambles. They just went and took out their leader because they don't want to make peace with these wildlings. They don't believe or understand the threat that they're facing. And in a lot of ways, I think they're supposed to represent the point of view that needs to be overcome. So to me, they're on the decline, and it would certainly be an indicator, if the wall is breached, of just how much of a failure the Night's Watch has now become. Partially because they haven't been supporting it for years and years and years. They've only been sending the lowest of the low, who are these, murderers, rapers, people who aren't going to be loyal to the realm, but are, just loyal to themselves. So I'm not, I don't have any emotional attachment to the wall. And to me, I think symbolically it would be really powerful, because it could be the barbarian horde coming over, which, the Night's Watch thinks is the wildlings, but it's really much worse if it's the White Walkers coming over. And I totally agree that the free folk are another culture coming to put pressure on the feudalism of Westeros with their ideas about freedom. They certainly are not going to pledge oaths to liege lords or adopt banners, or, I mean, they won't even march. Remember how when Ygritte came and she's like, what do you mean you all march down the road in time? That's ridiculous. And, so they're going to come with some radically different ideas, which is pretty exciting, but also a real threat to the status quo.
When you put it that way, that makes a lot more sense, because it does show the disregard that the royal class and everything have. They've just ignored the North and the Wall, and and it's kind of not to talk real world, but you see that my job in real life is running call centers, and you will start losing agents, and things will be starting to be a little starting to slip, and everyone's like, oh, it's fine, and then all of a sudden things are really bad because they've ignored it too long. And when you put it that way, you can absolutely see that's what's going to happen here, that they haven't put this as a priority. They haven't invested in the people protecting the Wall, and it's going to come back and bite them. So, yeah, okay. You've convinced me. I say bring that SOB down. I'm ready. Let's burn it up.
It's a failure of imagination, right?
Right.
That it could possibly, there couldn't have possibly been. I mean, Tyrion points that out, right? He thinks all those things are a myth. He tells Jon Snow, there's no such thing as all that stuff that's on the other side of the Wall. There are no giants. There are no giant spiders. That stuff doesn't exist. Those are just, fairy tales that somebody told you to keep you in line. And now, obviously, Tyrion's rethinking that view since he's seen what he's seen.
Absolutely.
In Old Valyria.
Everybody operates under a lot of delusions, and it's fun to see our characters who are so certain in their belief shaken a little bit when they see dragons and people come back from the dead and zombies and giants and all the other magic that's creeping in around the fringes of the world and impacting our characters. So if the Wall does come down, I think more of that will become mainstream, and people who have actually seen a lot of those things will now be out telling firsthand tales of, no, you got to believe it.
Yeah, I think we just haven't reached the critical mass or the tipping point yet. We haven't quite closed the literal geography, the gaps. But as we were talking last week about dragons, there could be more dragons that hatch that are beyond these three. We talked about maybe these three could actually reproduce, which is certainly possible. But there could also be places where, they just hatch because, I don't know, maybe there's winter's coming, but are the volcanoes getting a little bit more fiery too? Because that's where dragons seem to like to hang out. So, or just because of the fire and magic power that's in the world now because of these red priests and priestesses amplifying it could be what wakes them back up too. I mean, who knows? But there's some connection between the dragon's magic and the fire magic of the red god. So there's a lot of wild cards out there, and we keep seeing how the people who are willing to consider that they don't know things are the ones who stay alive. Davos is certainly, Sir Davos is one example. Even Jorah, to some extent, is probably, even though he's got grayscale, he's probably still savvy enough to stay alive because of all these places he's been to, if he ever got back to Westeros. But he'll have a little credibility problem if he did. But anyway, I thought that was a really interesting video about the others. And also, they pointed out that, again, we only know the others from these stories that, there's nothing written because these events happened 8,000 years ago. So we don't have any really good intel. At one point, they went to the place where the first men had camped, or they had some primitive ruin. That was where Sam found the obsidian. But we don't know too much about anything that happened there. So the other plausible argument by Itamar was that we just don't understand what the others want. And he points out in the books, and Shannon, you'll have to remind me because I don't remember this, even though I did listen to book 1 on CD, that in the very first chapter when the Night's Watch guys are being attacked by the others, they show that they have a sense of humor, was what they were claiming. And I don't recall that. But also in the histories of Westeros, the Night King supposedly was somebody from the Night's Watch, and he fell in love with an other, and they posit that means the others can love. And so if you can love, that means at some point you can form a human connection with them. So it's not necessarily an unbreachable gap between us and them, and you can find a common cause or connection, possibly. I'm curious. I haven't seen that in the show yet from the brief things we've seen of the others at all. The Night King was not looking fondly on the baby before he turned it that I saw. But they were definitely exhibiting strategy and tactics when they attacked Hardhome. And they did come to some ability to negotiate with Craster to keep the baby supply going.
Yeah, they called them the others originally, which I think is a good and loaded word, but on the show they opted not to because of and how common that term had become. But when we think about otherness, it's alien, it's foreign, it's sometimes used in modern political discourse as casting someone as an other, which is a somewhat derogatory term, meaning, it's just a culture we don't understand. And I think that's one of the points that you talked about that they were trying to make in those videos. They were probably more optimistic about it than I would be, saying, well, maybe they're the good guys in their own story, or if we take a step back and look at it in the grand scheme, maybe they have some noble or not evil purposes. We have certainly not seen that in the books. We've seen more others or White Walkers or Night's Kings on the show than we have in the novels. And from what we've seen depicted on the show, it's been a lot of menace, the deal with Craster, but if you look at it from inside their culture, maybe that's the way that they do reproduce, that the sentient White Walkers occur when they change a baby through that method that we saw at that Stonehenge-looking place, and the ones they take from Craster's. And then the less sentient zombie-like foot soldiers are the ones that do the hand-wavy rise from the dead on a battlefield kind of things. And within their society, they have their own caste system. But we don't know when we only know how they've been depicted. And going back to that first scene, good Lord, it's been so many years since I read that first chapter of the book again. I don't remember them being funny necessarily. Maybe there was an air of mystery and playfulness, maybe and somebody playing with their food to a certain degree. But I don't remember it being, I didn't get the sense at that point. And again, this is years old memories, that I didn't get the sense that they were a sentient separate race of creatures at that point. I got more supernatural menace without much into it. But it might be worth going back and reading that first chapter just to see what they were talking about. But that is a interesting take on, what is the others' perspective on all this. And I would freak out if there was a point of view chapter in the next book that came from the position of another. And you were right, Wendy, about the lore and legend of how they said it may have been a Stark or a Stark's descendant or related to the Stark, who was the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch way back in the day and then fell in love with an other. So you're right. That would suggest communication and beauty and culture, not to mention the biological components of it.
This is really interesting. The hero, the villain is always the hero in his own story. And you hear actors say that often, and I think that is true. I think to play someone who's a villain, you have to have in your mind that you're doing the right thing and you are, you're the lead character in the movie of your life. And and I do wonder, they certainly have behaved, as Shannon talked about, in less than, charming ways. And it's creepy as heck that, when you fall on the battleground and, we do the rise up, as we talked about, the Springsteen, their favorite song, and all of a sudden these, zombies are coming up. And I'm curious to see where this is going, and to see, and if it's like most things on this show, and I assume from the books, no one's all good and no one's all bad. And so there could be, there's some gray in there, even though they're white walkers, to see what happens. So interesting discussion. I am so glad you found this academy, because they really do give you a lot of things to think about, with a lot of fun. And so good stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of good fun in there, from the modern parallels to, the whole thing with the wall separating the Mexicans who are trying to come and take our jobs. But and it is that whole turning, it's vilification, right? You're turning people that are in opposition to you into something other, right? So that you can stick other kinds of bad names onto it and polarize them even further if that's your agenda. So it's a way you can fundraise and you can rally support. And in that feudalist society, right, that's a good way to stay in power. You keep the country sort of perpetually at war and perpetually infighting, waiting, all in service to prevent something worse from happening, So there's a lot of interesting ideas, I think, with the others and what can be projected on them. The other thing I wanted to point out was in the video, I'm not sure if it was Itamar or Gil, they said that in the books, the others are not, when they read the books, they did not visualize the others the way they were shown on the TV show. And I don't remember how they were described when I read book one. I have no mental picture that was planted from that. I already had a picture in my mind because I watched the show first. So they were saying that the others are sort of more colorful and almost have a kind of ethereal beauty to them, which also might be why they think it's more plausible that they're not as pure evil as we might think from the show. But to me, I think it's similar to the dragons, where because they're magical, there's this kind of element of unpredictability that there's a limit to how much they can really be an ally with anyone. It's like cats and dogs living together.
Mass hysteria.
Exactly. We're on the edge at any moment. The Marshmallow Man is coming. So, but I totally agree. I think these videos are awesome. Highly encourage folks to check out the Game of Thrones Academy YouTube channel. And hopefully we'll, be able to talk about these some more, maybe even talk directly with Itamar and Gil. We kind of are stalking them right now in hopes that we might actually get some FaceTime with them at some point.
Yes, we are. In fact, as we were recording, I just sent another, hey, we're talking about this video on Tuning Into Sci-Fi. We love you. Hey, we want to talk.
Yes, we're tearing down the walls.
Yes,
between
we are.
Podcasting and YouTubing.
Yes.
Who's the others in that scenario?
I don't think there is one. Yeah. I think we're just on two different channels.
That's right.
One's analog and the other's digital, maybe.
Yes.
It's all your point of view.
Exactly. Which it's funny you mentioned that because that is George Martin's whole precept for this, right? We only know the story from the point of view of the characters that we see on TV or we get to hear in the books.
Right.
So I think that's a good place to wrap up for tonight. We would love to hear your point of view about anything we've been talking about. If you have any feedback or questions. And until we hear from you, we will see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
We love to get your feedback. Call us at 206-202-4182 or leave us a Skype voicemail to our Tuning Into Sci-Fi TV name. We have many ways to keep the discussion going on our blog. Drop by tuningintoscifitv.com and leave a comment. On the blog, you'll also find links to the forum discussions and other links to follow our Twitter and RSS feeds and find our Facebook account.
Listen to Tuning Into Sci-Fi TV on Stitcher Radio On Demand. Download the free app today at Stitcher.com. You've been listening to a Game of Thrones special from Tuning Into Sci-Fi TV, Episode 53, recorded August 11th, 2015.